Thank you for that kind introduction, Adam, and the opportunity to speak here today. I do a fair amount of speaking on college campuses, and which has been absolutely no fun lately. With all the security measures in place that have to be taken, and all the talk of safe spaces and microaggressions and trigger warnings and other nonsense that parents today are paying $60,000 a year to subject their children to. So I do appreciate this change of venue, and the Arizona weather does not help, doesn't hurt either, so thank you. I was asked to talk about how philanthropy can help overcome racial divisions in America, and I don't have any doubt that philanthropy is playing and can continue to play a constructive role on that front. There is a long history in this country of wealthy individuals working to improve black outcomes and having a good deal of success doing that. But I also think you face considerable challenges today. The challenges aren't unique, but I think they are ascendant in many cases, and that's what I wanted to focus on talking about today. And I'm not necessarily talking about the current president and the way he has exacerbated racial divisions. He's not helping matters, but these trends predate his election. Polling conducted in the final months of the Obama presidency found that race relations in the US were at their lowest point in a quarter century. A New York Times poll from July of 2016 reported that 60% of Americans, including large majorities of both blacks and whites, felt race relations were generally bad. And nearly 40% said they were getting worse. A CNN poll conducted a couple months earlier found that the share of people who thought race relations had improved under President Obama fell from 32% in 2009 to 15% by 2016. And the share of people who thought race relations had worsened grew from 6% in 2009 to 39% in 2016. I think those divisions had a lot to do with how Obama and his administration handled these high-profile police shootings, which were magnified on social media and played into the left's identity politics. Obama's attempts to advance black interests through heightened group identity and us versus them rhetoric only made matters worse, in my view. He embraced openly white groups like Black Lives Matter and racially polarizing figures like Al Sharpton, who was a regular visitor to his White House. When you're looking to bring the races together, Al Sharpton is not the first person you call, in my opinion. The subsequent rise of the alt-right may be history repeating itself. The Black Power movement of the 1960s was followed by an increase in the number of skinheads and other white identity groups in the 1970s and 80s, including among more educated whites who had previously kept their distance from these folks. So today we have individuals like Richard Spencer, who led the Charlottesville rallies and is one of the country's more prominent white nationalists. Spencer is the son of a physician. He earned degrees from the University of Virginia and the University of Chicago before dropping out of a doctoral program at Duke. Two can play this identity politics game. And today, some conservatives seem just as enamored with racial political appeals as those on the left. I think both sides should cut it out, but things might get worse before they get better. As I said, Donald Trump has not helped matters, but even before he became president, race relations in this country are at their lowest point since the Los Angeles riots back in 1992. So that's one reason you have your work cut out for you. Another reason is the black leadership today and the type of thinking that has gained currency in recent years. And let me tell you a quick story to illustrate what I mean. A few years ago, I used a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. in one of my columns in the Wall Street Journal. The column was about the prevalence of violent crime in black neighborhoods. King had once told a black congregation, quote, "Do you know that Negroes are 10% of the population in St. Louis and responsible for 58% of the crimes, he said, we've got to face that. We've got to do something about our moral standards. We know there are many things wrong in the white world, but there are many things wrong in the black world too. We can't keep on blaming the white man. There are things we must do for ourselves, unquote. After the column ran, a number of readers on social media accused me of making up the quote, which comes from a 1961 profile of King in Harper's Magazine that was written by James Baldwin. I was a little surprised by the accusation because the article can be retrieved through a relatively quick Google search. But what really struck me about the accusation is that most of the people making it, perhaps all of the people making it, apparently just couldn't believe that the nation's most prominent civil rights leaders used to speak this way. They used to speak this way about problems in the black community and the role of personal responsibility, which might tell you everything you need to know about what passes for black leadership today. Now, King was obviously a uniquely gifted and capable leader, and I'm not suggesting that black people today need another Martin Luther King Jr. They don't. What I'm suggesting is that King represented a type of leadership, a good faith approach to closing racial divisions that black leaders today, like Al Sharpton and the NAACP and the Black Lives Matter activists, barely even give lip service to. King and his generation of leaders believed that whites had a role to play, but blacks also had a role to play. And they were willing to hold blacks accountable, despite the racism, the legal and rampant racism that existed at the time. They operated with the belief and tried to instill in young people the belief that blacks must succeed notwithstanding these racial barriers, that we can't sit around waiting for whites to get their act together. There's no time for that. As King put it, we can't keep blaming white people for our problems. There are things we must do for ourselves. By contrast, today's black leadership focuses on making excuses for antisocial black behavior. They send young black kids out into the world with a chip on their shoulder. They tell them the cops are gunning for them. The teachers are racist. The tests are racist. Employers are racist. The judges and prosecutors, the entire criminal justice system is stacked against them. They tell them the world owes them, that they're perpetual victims, and that if they don't succeed, it's not their fault. So at a time when young blacks are far more likely to experience racial preferences than racial slights, at a time when young black people today came of age with a twice-elected black president, not to mention black attorneys general, black mayors, black police chiefs, black school superintendents. At a time like this, the leadership insists that blacks can't be held responsible for these racial gaps until white racism has been vanquished from America. So you're dealing in many cases with self-appointed black leaders who consider talk of black responsibility and accountability to be itself a form of racism. And you're dealing with an academic and political and media environment that for the most part takes the side of these black leaders. And these leaders have little interest in bridging these racial divides, to be honest. In fact, their livelihood in many cases depends on exploiting these divides. And that's what they specialize in doing. Again, they may pay lip service to King's belief in a colorblind approach. They may regularly lament the fact that Obama's election didn't lead to a post-racial America. But that's not what they want. When you call your organization Black Lives Matter and then bristle at anyone who says all lives matter, you are not interested in being post-racial. When you call for racially gerrymandered voting districts and race-based college admissions and racial quotas in hiring, you are not interested in color blindness. You want color consciousness. You want race to remain front and center in our national discussions. Racial division isn't a problem for you, it's your meal ticket. It gets your voters to the polls. It keeps your civil rights organization relevant. It funds your social activism. This week, the NAACP called on blacks to boycott American Airlines. Company officials immediately asked to meet with the NAACP leadership. Will anyone here be surprised if American Airlines announces that it is about to cut a big fat check to the NAACP? So what I'm saying is that you may be sincerely interested in closing racial divisions, but a lot of other people out there have no problem with these divisions, and they're not all of them are members of the alt-right. Black leaders have also done an excellent job, and this adds to your challenge, of convincing blacks that the answers to their socioeconomic problems lie not with fixing their own problems or turning to the private sector, but rather in seeking government solutions. Since the 1960s, civil rights leaders have made a concerted effort to integrate political institutions, and they've had a great deal of success on that front. By the early 1980s, major US cities, including those with large black populations, such as Cleveland, Detroit, Chicago, Washington, Philadelphia, had elected black mayors. By the early 1990s, more than 300 cities, in fact, had black mayors in the US. Between 1970 and 2010, the number of black elected officials in this country grew from fewer than 1,500 to more than 10,000, including, of course, a twice-elected black president. In addition, we saw a proliferation of black police chiefs and school superintendents and council members, and state legislators. Racially gerrymandered voting districts ensured the election of black congressmen, and so forth. The problem is that all of this political clout never really paid off economically for the black poor, which is what we were told would happen. You look at how the black underclass fared in Coleman Young's Detroit, or Sharp James's Newark, or Marion Barry's Washington, D.C. These black mayors created these unbeatable political machines in the name of helping the black poor. Yet the poor became even more impoverished on their watch. Mississippi has long boasted more black elected officials than any other state, yet it continues to have one of the highest black poverty rates in the country. Now, this history should have served to temper expectations for the first black president, not to mention expectations of what government and elected officials can do on behalf of the black poor. Without taking anything away from Obama's historic accomplishment or the country's widespread pride in the racial progress that his election symbolized, the reality is that there was little reason to believe that a black president was the answer to racial inequities or the problems of the black poor. And sure enough, black-white gaps in household income, poverty, home ownership, and other measures all widened under Obama. The job situation did improve toward the end of his second term, but blacks did not see their average unemployment rate fall below double digits until the third month of Obama's 7th year in office. So now we have more evidence that the proliferation of black politicians in recent decades, which now includes a twice-elected black president, has done little to narrow racial gaps in employment, income, home ownership, academic achievement, and other areas. This is not to say that blacks should not run for office or engage politically. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm questioning is whether gaining political influence should continue to play such a central role in efforts to help blacks advance, or whether black leaders and others interested in addressing these racial inequalities would do better to focus their attention elsewhere. Nor am I suggesting that the Obama presidency caused these gaps to widen. I'm not suggesting there's a causal link here. Racial inequality has widened under white mayors and governors and presidents as well. What I'm suggesting is that the belief that a black president would make a huge difference in racial inequality was misplaced. It may seem counterintuitive, but the reality is that most groups in America that have risen economically have done so with little or no political influence. I'm talking about racial and ethnic minority groups that have moved from poverty to prosperity. And groups that have enjoyed early political success have tended to rise more slowly economically. You can look at the experience of Germans or the experience of Jews or Italians or Asians, all of whom saw economic gains precede political gains in the US. Nor is this something unique to the experience of minority groups here in America. The ethnic Chinese in Southeast Asia, the English in Argentina, Jews in Britain are among many examples of people who prospered economically while mostly shunning politics. A counterexample, and the example that I believe blacks have most closely followed, is the Irish, whose rise from poverty was especially slow, even though Irish-run political organizations in places like Boston and Philadelphia dominated local government. In fact, the Irish had more political success in the US than any other ethnic group historically. Yet the Irish were the slowest rising of all European immigrants to America in terms of economics. The political power of a relatively few number of Irish American elected officials had little impact on the economic prospects of most Irish Americans. And it really wasn't until we saw the decline of those Irish political machines that we started to see the Irish middle class really start to swell. So viewed against this history, many people were expecting Obama's presidency to deliver more prosperity, and political clout tends to deliver for a group in the US or anywhere else. The black experience in America is, of course, different from the Irish experience or the Chinese, German, or Jewish experience. We can't even really generalize about the black experience, since the experience of black immigrants from the Caribbean or Africa is going to differ from the experience of black natives. But that doesn't mean group cultural traits that show patterns of success or failure should be ignored entirely. Even if we can't make perfect apples-to-apples comparisons, it doesn't mean we can't make any comparisons or draw any conclusions. Many different racial and ethnic minority groups have experienced various degrees of hardship in the US and in other countries all over the world. And how those groups responded to those circumstances, how they dealt with that adversity, is something to be studied closely and to draw lessons from going forward, even if the only lesson is to manage expectations. And one of the clearest lessons from this history is that human capital, and by that I mean the collective skills and knowledge that create economic value, human capital has proven to be far more important than political capital in getting ahead. A group's racial or ethnic culture, its attitudes, its habits, its behaviors, its values matter more, much more, than electing people who look like them. And that reality helps explain why blacks fared the way they did, not only in the Obama era, but in the preceding decades. I think philanthropists today that want to improve black outcomes and close racial gaps should focus on helping blacks develop this human capital, or get back to developing this human capital the way that they were in an earlier era. The focus ought to be on helping blacks getting back to helping themselves. Prior to the 1960s, and in the first half of the 20th century, when blacks were more focused on developing this human capital, we saw racial gaps narrowing in income, educational attainment, representation in the skilled professions, and so forth. Blacks were not only making gains in absolute terms, they were gaining on whites. The progress was slow in some cases, but it was steady. Yet in the wake of the Great Society welfare state expansions of the 1960s, and in the wake of the black leadership's decision to shift focus to attaining more political power. That previous progress slowed down or stalled, or in some cases, even reversed course. Between 1890 and 1940, for example, black marriage rates in the US were higher than white marriage rates. In the 1940s and 50s, black labor participation rates exceeded those of whites. Black incomes grew at a much faster rate than white incomes, and the black poverty rate fell by 40 percentage points. Between 1940 and 1970, so we're talking about the Jim Crow era, prior to the era of affirmative action, the number of blacks in middle-class professions, talking about accountants and engineers and teachers and nurses and lawyers and doctors, quadrupled during this period. In other words, racial gaps were narrowing. Progress was being made. It was being made during a time of rampant racism. It was being made when blacks had very little political clout. And it was being made at a time when the government was at best indifferent to what was happening to blacks. Blacks were making progress because the focus was on developing this human capital, I believe, which allowed them to take advantage of expanding opportunities in this country. I think that what's largely missing from most of today's discussions about racial inequality, and whether we're talking about racial gaps in employment or education or crime or income or other measures, is the role that culture plays. In the post-60s era, black culture, particularly among the black poor, changed for the worse. Attitudes changed, habits changed, values changed. And all of these changes undermine the development of that black human capital. Unfortunately, today we seem unable even to have an honest discussion about the underdevelopment of black human capital that I believe is so closely associated with these persistent racial disparities. And nowhere is this more evident than in discussion about crime in this country. The social scientist James Q. Wilson once remarked that, quote, a central problem, perhaps the central problem in improving the relationship between white and black Americans is the difference in racial crime rates, unquote. I would add that an equally important problem today is that we don't have honest discussions about the racial differences in crime rates. We look at these high violent crime rates in our inner cities, and too many people want to blame racism or poverty or rogue cops or the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. Never mind that the black violent crime rate was lower in the first half of the 20th century than it is today. Never mind that the homicide rate for black men fell by 18% in the 1940s and another 22% in the 1950s. Was there less black poverty and white racism back then? As recently as the early 1960s, 2 out of 3 black children were raised by a mother and a father. Today, more than 70% are not. And today's black violent crime rates, are today's black violent crime rates a legacy of slavery and Jim Crow, or a legacy of the misguided policy interventions of the 1960s, when we started going easier on criminals and started subsidizing irresponsible behavior with welfare checks? Unfortunately, that's a question few on the left will even entertain. I can't think of a more dishonest discussion taking place than the one about race and crime. In the media, on college campuses, among civil rights activists, political figures, even in the world of sports, a fundamentally dishonest narrative has taken hold. The press is very eager to break down police shootings by race, but hesitant to break down criminal behavior by race, which gives the public a distorted picture of what's happening. Study after study, going back decades, has shown that blacks are arrested and incarcerated at higher rates than whites based on behavior, not racism. That doesn't mean that there are no racist cops or no cops who abuse their authority. What it means is that racism is an inadequate explanation for higher rates of arrest and incarceration among blacks. There's no complete national database on police shootings in this country. Some police departments report more extensive data than other police departments. And perhaps some uniform system should be put in place. I'd certainly have no objection to that. But the data we do have show that in a typical year, police are involved in approximately 2 or 3% of black shooting deaths. In the first half of last year, there were about 2,100 shootings in Chicago, 2,100. Out of those 2,100, a total of 9 involved police. Over the course of the entire year, there were more than 4,300 shootings in Chicago. Almost all of the shooting victims were black, and more than 99% of the shootings were carried out by civilians, not cops. Obviously, young black men in Chicago don't roam the streets in fear of getting shot by police. But you would never know that reading the media coverage. In New York, where I'm based, which has the nation's largest population and the nation's largest police force, the city has kept detailed records on police shootings since 1971. And that year, police shot 314 people, 93 of them fatally. 2 decades later, in 1991, the number of police shootings had fallen from 314 to 108. And fatalities had fallen from 93 to 27. By 2015, the number of people shot by New York City cops had fallen to 23, with 8 fatalities. So we're talking about a reduction in police shootings and fatalities of more than 90% over the past 4.5 decades in the nation's largest city, with the nation's largest police force. And the story is similar in other major cities. Police shootings have fallen dramatically in recent decades. Police are less likely to draw their weapons. According to figures from the Centers for Disease Control, police shootings of black people have fallen by more than 70% nationwide since 1970. The evidence shows that police today are less likely, much less likely, to use their weapons than they were in the past, especially with regards to dealing with black suspects. The idea of trigger-happy cops out there today gunning for black men is a myth. Yet today we have football players refusing to stand for the national anthem in protest of cops targeting young black men. We have an entire movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, based on this myth. They think there is some epidemic going on out there. It's a narrative that has gained tremendous currency based on anecdotal evidence, social media videos that have gone viral. But there is no empirical data to support this. We reached a point where the facts don't matter. What matters is controlling the narrative, and they control the narrative. Last year, a black economist at Harvard named Roland Fryer released a study of more than 1,300 police shootings going back to the year 2000. He said he had expected to find racial bias in the data. Instead, he found none. In fact, he found that officers were 47% less likely to discharge their firearms before being attacked if the subject was black than if the subject was white. 47% less likely. His study also found that black and white victims of police shootings were equally likely to have been armed, which further undercuts the notion that cops are gunning for blacks out of racial prejudice. The evidence that we have certainly does not support that claim. Again, the activists want to talk about cops or racism or drug laws or poverty, anything to avoid talking about crime rates. But on some level, the policing in these neighborhoods is an effect, not a cause. We can't pretend there aren't legitimate reasons for why black ghettos draw police attention. The cops are there because that is where the 9/11 calls originate. And tension between police and these communities will continue so long as these crime rates continue. This national discussion about race and crime is important because the violence that is so prevalent in these neighborhoods has enormous social and economic consequences as well. Poverty doesn't cause crime, but crime does cause poverty. Businesses leave crime-ridden neighborhoods, jobs follow, property values fall. One reason that blacks were progressing at a much faster rate in the first half of the 20th century, when black political power was minimal and racism was legal and widespread, is that black communities were much less violent back then. A previous generation of philanthropists, Carnegie, Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, focused on improving the quality of education for blacks. Julius Rosenwald helped Booker T. Washington construct thousands of schools, more than 5,300 in fact, in the rural South in the early part of the 20th century, some of which were attended by people like John Lewis, who would go on to become leaders in the civil rights movement. Given the continuing black-white divide in education and the continuing inability of traditional public schools to close it, I hope philanthropists can continue to focus their attention on alternative ways of educating the black poor. I think prison reentry programs are another area that deserve more focus than it receives. Most of the people in prison will get out one day, and we need to find ways for them to be productive citizens and stay out of trouble. And that goes beyond job programs and housing. It's also about going after these occupational licensing requirements that prevent someone from starting a jitney service or a hair braiding service. It's about going after minimum wage hikes that price younger, less experienced blacks out of the labor force. So there are ways, I think, that philanthropists can make a very constructive difference in what's going on. But perhaps the biggest challenge for you, or anyone else who wants to help close racial divisions in our society, is pushing back against that prevailing narrative about how racism impacts black progress in the 21st century. The political left utterly controls this narrative, and it is an entirely self-serving narrative. They have no interest in acknowledging that there are fewer racial barriers today and that the remaining ones cannot entirely explain these racial gaps that we see. I think we have to find ways to push back very hard against this false narrative. I try and do it on television, on the radio, social media, newspaper columns. I do it by speaking on college campuses. I do it through writing books. And I think you should find other people who want to do it. And I'm not talking about your bomb throwers on the far right, your Ann Coulters or your Milos. I think that's mostly performance art. You want to find serious people who can deal in fact and are interested more in shedding light than heat on these issues, which of course are already very emotional issues. It also helps if they can bring some historical perspective to the discussion, as I've tried to do here. The social pathology we see in black ghettos today is not the norm. Things have not always been this bad. Here's William Julius Wilson, the black sociologist, describing Harlem and other poor black neighborhoods in the 1940s and 50s. He writes, "Despite a high rate of poverty in ghetto neighborhoods throughout the first half of the 20th century, rates of inner-city joblessness, teenage pregnancy, out-of-wedlock births, female-headed families, welfare dependency, and serious crime were significantly lower than in later years and did not reach catastrophic proportions until the mid-1970s. There was crime, to be sure, but it did not reach the point where people were fearful of walking the streets at night, despite the overwhelming poverty in the area. There was joblessness, but it was nowhere near the proportions of unemployment and labor force non-participation that have gripped ghetto communities since the 1970s. There were single-parent families, but they were a small minority of all black families and tended to be incorporated within extended family networks and to be headed not by unwed teenagers and young adult women, but by middle-aged women who usually were widowed, separated, or divorced. There were welfare recipients, but only a very small percentage of families could be said to be welfare dependent. In short, unlike the present period, inner city communities prior to 1960 exhibited the features of social organization, including a sense of community, positive neighborhood identification, and explicit norms and sanctions against aberrant behavior. Unquote. In other words, blacks living under Jim Crow conditions and only a couple generations removed from slavery had more stable families and lived in safer communities than their counterparts living under a twice-elected black president. 70 years ago, racial disparities in employment, educational attainment, poverty, crime, and income were narrowing. But those trends reversed in the wake of 1960s policy interventions and increasing black political power. Now, no, I am not calling for a return to Jim Crow. And I have to make that clear, actually, because that would be the headline. Journalist says blacks were better off under Jim Crow. I've been there, trust me. I point out those previous trends for two reasons. It exposes the limits of a strategy that encourages blacks to rely on political power and government solutions to get ahead. And it exposes the weakness of the argument that white racism mostly explains racial gaps today. Now, for various reasons, many people want to deny this history, this historical reality, or cast aspersions at anyone interested in exploring it. But it's worth exploring. It's worth you looking into and finding other people who want to talk about it. More than anything else, the black underclass today needs human capital, the values, the habits, the attitudes, and behaviors that facilitated the economic advancement of other racial and ethnic groups. And that indeed was facilitating unprecedented advancement among blacks of an earlier period. I'll stop there and take any questions if you have them. Thank you.